Hi everyone. What I want to share today is how I've added forward-facing LED flashlights to my power wheelchair. So the first step in this process was actually selecting what flashlight I would use. I went to the local dollar store and I chose one that has a metal housing. So that's the outside of it is made of metal. The reason I chose this is because I plan to epoxy the flashlight onto the wheelchair. Metal tends to cure better than plastic housing, and there's more options for epoxies that are for metal applications than plastic applications. I was also very particular when I selected the flashlight. You've got the end that has the light, it unscrews, and then there's the section at the end where the batteries come in and out, and it unscrews. So the middle section is what I can epoxy it onto the wheelchair, and it worked out really well, I might add. You want to make sure you give yourself the most options. So for example, if the light burned out, I almost am positive that I could find another replacement at the dollar store just to re-screw on the light. LED lights tend to last 10,000 hours or more. So I'm really expecting this to outlast the wheelchair. But I want to make sure that I'm giving myself options if I need to. So after you've obtained the flashlight, you need to give careful attention to the position on the wheelchair where it's going to go. So you can't interfere with wires such as the joystick or any extra controls you have on your wheelchair if the back has power tilting, or if the footrest comes up and down, or any of the seat elevation. You need to avoid wires. You need to allow for maintenance access. So you need to look for where there are screws or Allen key bolts, and also where there are moving parts on the wheelchair so you don't block them. So what I mean by moving parts on the wheelchair is, so for most wheelchairs, the armrest is able to come up for a side transfer onto the wheelchair. So you don't want to block the options that have been given to you that make a wheelchair better than a scooter as your means of mobility. Also, you need to consider how you will move and replace the batteries for the flashlight if you aren't going to hardwire it into the wheelchair batteries. What I mean by this is, if you install a wheelchair horizontally, you're going to need to wrap tape around your finger to get the batteries out each time. Now, if you install it but you put it on the arm support and the arm support tips up, well, that'll let the batteries just fall out and make changing them a lot easier. So you need to give some thought to functionality. The next item is measuring and marking where the light is going to go on the wheelchair. So what's important about this is to make sure that you decide where you're going to fit it on your wheelchair. In the application that I'm showing you today, I put the flashlight where there was the protective foam around one of the metal bars. So I had to take my utility knife and cut out a little rectangle for the epoxy to go on. So I want to make sure you've thought this through, and it did work for me, but I'm just telling you ahead of time to be intentional. You know, if you don't want to get into epoxy and cutting out the protective foam, you have the option of cable tying the flashlight to the wheelchair. If you look around your wheelchair, you're going to see cable ties that were used for the cord that goes to the joystick and any other power accessories that are on your wheelchair. So I want you to think through if it's better for you to cable tie it or epoxy it. I chose epoxy because I'm confident in what I'm doing. I've given a lot of thought to it and really planned it out. So for me, it's the right decision to epoxy it. If you're going to epoxy it, I would suggest you have a 5 or 10 minute conversation with the technician that services your wheelchair. And when I was dealing with the service technician, he was very open to the discussion relating to this and was quite good about it. So that might be an option for you to consider. The next step is taping the flashlight into the position where you want it mounted on your wheelchair. So this is to epoxy it into place. So what you're going to do is tape it around the light and then around the battery access for the flashlight, and then you want to put a piece of tape so the epoxy won't just drain through. When I put the epoxy in, I did it from the bottom side up after I removed the wheelchair arm. The wheelchair arm's meant to come off, so it wasn't a big production to get it off of the wheelchair. So I wanted the top to look smooth, and then on the bottom side I put tape around the foam so I wouldn't be epoxying above it, and I put tape on the metal flashlight housing so I would also be keeping the flashlight looking smooth and with straight edges. You know, I care about my work, and I also don't want to cut myself by accident if the epoxy was to have a jagged edge. So I used tape, the same idea as painter's tape for painting around windows and doors or wall outlets, for example. You want to ensure the tape forms the bottom so the epoxy won't drip through. And I can't emphasize this enough. Next, you'll mix your epoxy. I want to suggest that you would not spend less than $8 on an epoxy for this project. I would not use dollar store epoxy to do this. You want to have an epoxy that has a high PSI rating. That's pounds per square inch. The reason this is important is so if you do touch the wheelchair on, maybe you're passing through a doorway, it won't just fall off on you. You want to make sure it's strong so that the flashlight's going to stay there and be robust. I used a Q-tip to apply the epoxy into the cavity that was created once the foam was cut away. So you could either apply the epoxy using a Q-tip or a paintbrush. The reason I did this was because I needed to mix around 3.5 tablespoons of epoxy. You know, it had to fill the gap that was between the metal tubing on the wheelchair and the flashlight housing. So it was a lot that I needed to mix up, and I just wanted to sort of plop it into place because while the epoxy was still a liquid, you still have time to move it around in gunks, almost like putting milk on a spoon, and maybe a little bit's going to fall off in the bowl before it gets to your mouth. But you need to make sure you can get it on and fast enough into where you're gluing the flashlight to the metal tubing. A tip for this is you can adjust the amount of hardener when you're mixing up the epoxy if you need a little bit more time to join it on and get the epoxy into where it's needed to make the join. I used JB Weld Marine Weld for this task because of the aluminum tubing on the flashlight, and the JB Weld, the page that it came on had instructions at the bottom of saying what it was suitable for, so it would apply to steel and aluminum, where the wheelchair tubing is steel in the area that I was joining onto. After the epoxy's in place, you want to remove the tape to make the straight edges. If you leave the tape for the edges to be straight on until the epoxy cures, it's actually going to tear the tape because of the strength of the epoxy once it's cured. So you want to get it off as soon as you're happy with it. Then finally, the tape at the end, and then where it's holding it from dripping through, needs to stay on the wheelchair for about 20 hours while it cures. So I'd suggest you use maybe masking tape or painter's tape that can be taken off and will not leave a resin residue on your wheelchair. And you need to be diligent to remove it after 20 hours. If you're having a friend do this for you, you need to make sure that you have the follow-up appointment set so the tape will come back off and won't get stuck on there. So eventually the resin in tape will leave. It's almost like a fingerprint, if you think of forensics, on the wheelchair or whatever surface it was being used for if it's not removed during the manufacturer time set. If you're concerned about this, there are 7-day and 14-day painter's tape available, and that may give someone that's relying on a friend to do this more time to complete the project. I want to remind you, for my application, I was able to take the arm right off the wheelchair, and I had it turned upside down while I was applying the epoxy. And it worked out best because it gives a clean, professional look to it, and I do care about my wheelchair as it's an extension of my body. So this is a quick look at my wheelchair, and these are the two parts that I had to access in order to remove the arm from the wheelchair. I just wanted to get you thinking about where it could be placed that will make this work out the best for you. Okay, I hope this is helpful for you. I've given a lot of information. Maybe you want to watch this a second or a third time so that you do a really good job when you're working on your specific project. I also want to commend you for adding lights to your wheelchair. About 8 months ago, I had a driver pull over on the side of the road to ask me to add lights to the wheelchair to make it easier for when he turned onto side streets so he could see that I was there. So my wheelchair was going like this, and he was worried that he could have hit me if there wasn't something to make me really visible. So it is worth the effort, and with how many dollar stores there are, this isn't really an expensive project. You know, you're looking at maybe a $20 investment, and then if you use rechargeable batteries, it may be another $5, but it's a good investment for when you're out after dark with your wheelchair. Hey, thank you very much for the time that you spent with me today. I really appreciate it. Bye for now.